The midnight train thundered across the ridges of Pennsylvania, its wheels shrieking against the steel tracks as it cut through the darkness of rural America. Inside the cars, passengers dozed, read books, scrolled on their phones, or stared out the windows at the blur of night. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks was strangely soothing, a mechanical heartbeat that carried hundreds of lives across the country. Then, without warning, the heartbeat stopped. Click. Every light in the carriage flickered once then. D-I-E-D-W-H-U-M-P. The hum of the engine faltered, coughing once, then fell silent. Darkness swallowed the train whole at first. There was silence and eerie pause where no one moved, as if the passengers were holding their collective breath. Then chaos erupted. A baby began to wail. A woman gasped and clutched her husband's arm. Somewhere further down the aisle, a teenage boy let out a loud, panicked laugh, the sound sharp in the blackness. What the hell just happened? A man shouted, Are we still moving? Another asked. No, a voice answered nervously. We've stopped. The train had halted on a lonely stretch of track, deep in the hills, where no towns or stations were in sight. The only light came from the moon filtering weakly through the windows, casting ghostly slivers across the frightened faces inside. Cell phones blinked to life here and there, but signals failed to connect. The countryside outside was a dead zone. Panic fed on itself quickly. Jesus, we're stranded out here. What if another train comes from behind? Call the crew. Where are the staff? The train attendants, young and inexperienced, tried to calm people, but their own voices trembled. Without electricity, even the intercom system was dead. Fear spread, thick and stifling, filling the air like smoke in a sealed room and in the corner. Unnoticed at first, an old man sat hunched by the window. His coat was torn, his shirt collar stained, and his beard looked like it had been trimmed by neglect rather than choice. A battered fedora sat crooked on his head, and clutched loosely in his hand was an empty glass bottle that smelled faintly of whiskey. Earlier in the journey, he had been a subject of ridicule. Two college boys seated across the aisle had pointed him out and whispered, Look at him. I bet he bought a one-way ticket just to sleep it off. Probably hasn't showered in a month. Yeah, classic drunk hobo. Surprised they even let him on. Others had stolen wary glances, silently agreeing. The old man looked like trouble, like the kind of passenger who didn't belong. He hadn't spoken a word, only muttered occasionally. Under his breath, eyes distant, as though he were watching something far beyond the present. But now, in the dark, he stirred. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head, and for the first time that night, his eyes were visible clear, piercing, and startlingly awake. They glimmered not with drunken haze, but with a sharpness that belonged to a man who saw more than the others could. He spoke, his voice rough but steady. The main engine's down. Backup power didn't trigger. That means the relay failed. Duh. Words landed oddly in the panicked carriage, too calm, too precise. A woman clutched her purse tighter and hissed, Ignore him, he's drunk. But the old man pushed himself to his feet. He was frail. His knees cracked as he straightened. But his movements carried a strange authority, as though his body still remembered another life. I need to get to the control compartment, he said firmly, scanning the aisle. The two college boys burst out laughing. Yeah, sure, old-timer. Why don't you go fix it with your magic whiskey bottle? Sit down before you break a hip. A ripple of laughter spread nervously across nearby passengers. In crisis, mockery was easier than trust. The old man ignored them. He started walking down the aisle, his boots tapping on the floor. His steps were not the clumsy shuffle of a drunk, but the deliberate march of someone who knew exactly where he was going. His hand brushed the wall for balance, and as he moved, he muttered softly, almost to himself, If the relay's fried, the capacitor will need a jump. Damn circuits never did like the cold, sir. A young attendant hurried toward him, panic etched across her face. She was barely in her 20s, cheeks pale in the moonlight. You can't go back there. Please return to your seat. The old man stopped, met her eyes, and said in a tone so certain it silenced her, Trust me. Something in his gaze, something unshakable, made her hesitate. Before she could protest again, he pushed through the door at the end of the carriage. vanishing into the pitch-black passage that led toward the engine room. For a moment, the passengers sat in stunned silence. "What the hell is he doing?" one man muttered. "Probably going to mess it up worse," another scoffed. "He's insane," a woman whispered, but the attendant stood frozen, her pulse hammering. She didn't know why, but she believed him. Then the noises began. Clinks, scrapes, the sound of metal against metal. A faint hum, the rhythmic click of switches being tested. Sparks snapped in the dark, followed by muffled curses in the unmistakable. Sound of hands working with expert familiarity. Minutes dragged by like ours. Fear gnawed at the passengers, some gripping each other's hands, others muttering prayers. The two college boys exchanged uneasy glances now, their bravado faltering, and then boom. A surge of light blazed overhead. Every bulb in the carriage flickered, then glowed bright, flooding the space with warm yellow light. Gasps of relief swept through the passengers. Children cried not in fear this time, but in sheer release of tension. The floor trembled beneath their feet as the engine coughed back to life, then roared in triumph. The train shuddered forward, wheels clanking back into motion. A wave of applause broke out. Passengers cheered, clapped, even laughed. The fear that had strangled them only moments ago dissolved into elation, and then the old man returned. He pushed the door open slowly, stepping back into the carriage. His hat was crooked, his coat smeared with grease, and his hands trembled. Faintly from exertion, yet his expression was calm, almost indifferent, as though what he had just done was ordinary. For a moment, the passengers stared in disbelief. That old man? Someone whispered he just saved us. The two college boys said nothing now. Their laughter was gone, replaced by shame. The attendant rushed to his side. "Sir, how? How did you know what to do?" The old man paused. His eyes, still sharp beneath the lines of age, softened with something almost like sorrow. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set the empty whiskey bottle down gently on an empty seat, as if laying down a burden. Finally, he murmured, "I built it." The words hung in the air, heavy with mystery. Before anyone could question further, the train surged into the night again, carrying with it not just passengers, but a secret waiting to be unveiled. Thomas Grayson's story began long before the midnight train lost its light. 30 years earlier, he had been a man with shoulders unbowed, his uniform pressed, and his name respected along every line of the Eastern Rail Company, a life forged. And still Thomas had grown up in the coal towns of West Virginia, where the sound of trains was as constant as the wind through the mountains. As a boy, he'd race along the tracks barefoot, waving at the locomotives that thundered past. His father worked the mines. His mother sewed clothes for neighbors. But Thomas dreamed only of steel, of engines, of the machines that seemed to breathe like giants. When he was 15, he dismantled an old radio just to understand how electricity traveled through its veins. By 18, he was repairing broken switchboards at the local station. By 25, he wore his first engineer's cap. And by 25, he was the man others called when everything else failed. "Send for Grayson," they used to say. "He'll get her running again." He had a gift, the ability to hear. Problem in the rhythm of an engine, to see solutions where others only saw broken wires. To Thomas, trains were not machines. They were living things. He listened to them, cared for them, coaxed them back to life when they faltered. The pride of the company in the 1980s. The Eastern Rail Company embarked on a massive modernization. Old steam relics had long been retired, but even the early electric systems were showing their age. The company needed innovation. Thomas was one of the men at the center of it. He worked long nights in workshops filled with sparks and smoke, drafting new circuits, designing safer relay systems. He argued with executives who wanted speed over safety, and he fought to install emergency backups that could save lives if disaster struck. When the new models rolled onto the rails, journalists interviewed him. He was photographed in his grease-stained uniform, smiling awkwardly beside gleaming locomotives. One article dubbed him the guardian of the rails. He never cared for fame. What mattered was knowing that passengers could travel across the country safely. that families could reunite. Commerce could move forward because of the systems he had helped build. A family waiting at home. His life was equally full. His wife, Margaret, had a laugh that reminded him of summer rain, light and refreshing, impossible to ignore. She understood his obsession with trains, even when it stole long nights from their marriage. She packed him lunches, patched his uniforms, and kissed him goodbye at dawn. Their daughter, Emily, had inherited his fascination. She loved visiting the depots, running her small hands along the iron wheels, asking question after question. "Daddy, why do the wheels spark? Daddy, how fast can it go? Daddy, will you take me on your train?" He did once, on her 12th birthday. He arranged for her to ride in the cab, her eyes wide as the countryside blurred past. She wore the engineer's cap he had given her and declared that her father had the best job in the world. Thomas carried that memory like a flame. Cracks in the steel, but steel, like men, can weaken with time. By the 1990s, the company was changing. Younger engineers, trained in new software and digital systems, began to replace the veterans who relied on instinct and experience. Thomas tried to adapt, but the world of computers and codes felt foreign to a man who had spent decades listening to the hum of transformers and the clank of gears. Meetings shifted. Executives cared more about cutting costs than about fail-safe systems. Thomas's warnings about maintenance budgets were dismissed. "The new tech will handle it," they said. "It's no need for old methods." One evening, after another 12-hour shift, Margaret found him at the kitchen table, staring at blueprints with tired eyes. "They don't listen anymore," he admitted. "They think I'm obsolete." She touched his hand gently. "Not to me, not to Emily, and not to the rails you've given your life to them." But within a year, Margaret fell ill. The hospital bills piled high. Thomas took every overtime shift offered, but when she passed, he was left with debts that no paycheck could erase. Emily, already in college, drifted further away, unable to bear the constant shadow of grief. And the company, once his home, finally let him go. Retirement, they called it, but there was no pension generous enough to sustain him, no honors ceremony, no farewell worth the decades he had given. Just a box of tools, a handshake, and a dismissal. The slow descent, without work, without Margaret, without Emily. The days stretched long and empty. Thomas haunted the stations, unable to sever his connection to the rails. At first, he still carried notebooks, sketching ideas for safer circuits, redesigns for brakes. But no one wanted to read them. Whiskey dulled. The ache. One bottle became 2, then 3. Soon, passengers and staff stopped seeing Thomas as an engineer at all. To them, he was just another drunk who muttered to himself, clutching papers that made no sense. He sold his house, slept in cheap motels, then in shelters, then sometimes not at all. But he always found his way back to trains. They were the only family left to him. When he boarded the midnight service that fateful night, most passengers saw only a ragged old man with a bottle. None saw the man who had once signed safety protocols. The man whose fingerprints were still on the circuits humming beneath their seats, returning to the present back in the glowing carriage. Moments after he had saved them, Thomas leaned on the seat for balance. The attendant stared at him in awe, the words "I built it" still ringing in her ears. Passengers were whispering now, their earlier mockery replaced by confusion and shame. Who was this man really? Why did he seem to know the train better than anyone alive? For Thomas, the applause and astonishment meant little. He wasn't thinking of them. He was thinking of Margaret's words at the kitchen table years ago. "Not to me, not to Emily, and not to the rails you've given your life to them." He had given his life to the rails. Tonight, for the first time in decades, they had called him back. The applause from the passengers faded into a restless murmur, but Thomas heard none of it. He sat quietly, his chest rising and falling with the strain of what he had just done, and his mind traitorous as ever drifted backward. The rails had never left him, even when everything else had. Yet for years he had wandered their edges not as a guardian, but as a ghost. The house that fell silent. After Margaret's death, Thomas's home became unbearably quiet. The laughter that once filled the kitchen, the clatter of her cooking, the warmth of her presence all gone in a single cruel season. He would walk through the rooms at night, hearing echoes that weren't really there. At first Emily called often. She was young, grieving too, but determined to be strong. "Dad, you need to eat, need to sleep. Promise me you're taking care of yourself," she would say. Thomas promised. But promises are easy when made over the phone. Soon her calls grew less frequent. College life demanded her time, then her job, then her own family. Each conversation became shorter, more distant, until one day, silence replaced her voice altogether. The house, once a sanctuary, became a tomb. Every photograph on the walls mocked him with memories. Every empty chair reminded him of absence. Eventually he sold it, unable to bear the loneliness any longer. Work without purpose, without Margaret. Work was all he had. But even that betrayed him. The company shifted toward automation and younger blood. Men like Thomas, whose knowledge came from instinct, from decades of grease under their nails, were seen as relics. He fought to prove himself, worked double shifts, volunteered for the dirtiest repairs. But progress was merciless. One cold autumn morning, he was summoned to an office he barely recognized. A man half his age sat behind the desk. "Thomas," the young manager said, not meeting his eyes, "the company's moving in a new direction. We're offering you early retirement." Retirement. A word that sounded like reward but felt like exile. He walked out with a cardboard box of tools and papers, while trains he had once nurtured roared on without him. That day, the tracks seemed colder than they ever had. The bottle it began with a single drink. "To Margaret," he whispered, raising a glass in the empty kitchen. One glass turned into two, then into a nightly ritual. Whiskey dulled the ache in his chest, blurred the sharp edges of memory, made silence bearable. When the money from the house sale dwindled, he moved to cheaper motels. When even that became too much, he sought shelters, then benches near stations. But always, he found his way back to the tracks. People saw only the bottle. They didn't see the man who, even in his stupor, traced invisible circuits on the table, who whispered about relays and capacitors as though they were old friends. They didn't hear him murmuring Margaret's name like a prayer. Society gave him a new identity: vagrant, drunk, nuisance. The engineer named Guardian of the Rails vanished into whispers of mockery. The station's Stamus lived in stations. The way other men lived in towns, he knew which benches were safest to sleep on, which guards turned a blind eye, which vending machines still dispensed warm coffee late at night. Some commuters recognized him, though never by name. "There's that old drunk again, don't sit near him. Poor soul. Probably lost his mind years ago." Children stared until their parents tugged them away. Attendants sighed when he boarded, muttering about one more stray. The company should keep off the cars. But Thomas never lashed out, carried his humiliation quietly, shoulders bent, hat pulled low. What else could he do? Dignity was a luxury he could no longer afford. Still, he listened. Even as they mocked him, he listened to the hum of trains, the rhythm of engines, the whispers of steel. His mind remained sharp, cataloging every sound. He noticed when brakes whined too loudly, when tracks rattled with wear, when lights flickered a second longer than they should. The world called him useless, but he never stopped being an engineer. The loneliness of being forgotten, what hurt more than poverty, more than mockery, was invisibility. He had given his life to the rails, yet no one remembered. Not the managers who cut him loose, not the passengers who rode safely on systems he had designed. Not even his daughter, who once called him a hero. He wrote letters to Emily sometimes, scrawled in uneven handwriting, pages smudged with grease and whiskey stains. Most were never sent. The few he did mail went unanswered. Whether out of shame or anger, he did not know. At night, lying on benches beneath the rumble of trains overhead, Thomas sometimes spoke aloud, as though Margaret still sat beside him. "They've forgotten me, love. But I haven't forgotten them. I can't." The rails were his only companion. They were unforgiving, yet constant. They had carried him as a boy, defined him as a man, and haunted him as an old soul. The midnight train, and so he drifted, a shadow among stations, until the night of the blackout. When he boarded the midnight train, the other passengers saw only a ragged figure with a bottle. They whispered, they laughed, they dismissed him. He didn't care. He had grown used to being overlooked, but when the lights died, when panic surged through the carriages, something deep within him awoke. It wasn't pride, nor anger, nor even duty. It was instinct. He couldn't ignore a wounded train. Not then. Not ever. And so he rose, unsteady but determined, and walked toward the compartment as though it had always been his destination. Back to the present in the carriage. The applause had subsided, but eyes still lingered on him. Some were filled with awe, others with shame, but none dared mock him now. Thomas sat back down, gripping the seat as if it anchored him to the present. For years he had been invisible. Tonight, for the first time, he had been seen. But being seen also meant being remembered, and memory was a cruel companion. His chest tightened with both pride and sorrow. Margaret's face swam before him. Emily's laughter echoed in his ears. For a brief moment, he was not the old drunk. He was Thomas Grayson, engineer, father, husband, and yet he knew this moment would pass. Passengers would forget by morning. The company would never remember. His daughter might never know. Still, tonight, the rails had called him back, and he had answered. The steel door clanged shut behind Thomas, cutting off the panicked voices of the passengers. Darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint glow of moonlight through a narrow window. The air smelled of metal and ozone, smell he knew as intimately as breath. He paused, letting his eyes adjust, his hand running instinctively along the wall. His fingers brushed a switchboard, cold and lifeless. He closed his eyes. In the silence, he could almost hear the heartbeat of the train, the rhythm that should have been there, but WASN, single quotes, Todd, same old flaw. Just like I warned them, his hands trembled not from age, but from something deeper. A flood of memory surged unbidden. Echoes of another time. It was 30 years earlier. The same compartment, brighter then, filled with the chatter of young engineers and the hum of freshly tested systems. Thomas had stood at the center, barking instructions, sleeves rolled up, confidence radiating from him like heat. Double check. The emergency switch. If the relay fails, the passengers will have nothing. You worry too much. Grayson, a younger colleague, had laughed. He remembered slamming his fist on the panel. Safety isn't worry. It's duty. Duty. The word rang in his skull as he opened his eyes to the present. The train was silent now, waiting for him. The rails had called him back, demanding the duty he had once promised. The work Thomas crouched by the panel, pulling it open with a grunt. Rusty hinges squealed. Inside, wires hung like veins, silent and cold. His fingertips traced them with the familiarity of an old surgeon. Main circuit dead. Backup never fired, he muttered. His voice steadied him. He fished in his coat pocket and pulled out a screwdriver, rusted, worn, but still useful. He had carried it for years, even when he carried nothing else. A relic of the man he used to be, his movements became sharper, more assured. He stripped wires with the pocket blade, reconnected fuses, bypassed corroded switches. Sparks snapped in the dark, lighting his lined face in brief flashes. Sweat rolled down his temple, stinging his eyes. But he didn't stop. In his mind, he wasn't an old drunk fumbling in the dark. He was Thomas Grayson, chief engineer, the man people once trusted with lives. Each connection he made pulled him further from despair, closer to who he had been. The weight of memory, but with each flick of the switch. Memories intruded. He saw Margaret standing at their doorway, her hands folded, smiling faintly. "Don't stay too late, Tom. You'll miss dinner again." He saw Emily, 12 years old, in the cab of the locomotive, cap too big for her head. Squealing with delight, "Faster, Daddy, faster." The ache nearly broke him. His hands slipped, sparking against the panel. He winced but clenched his jaw. Not now. Focus, Grayson. Focus. The train groaned faintly, as though urging him onward. The turning point, he found the failed relay, burnt out, blackened by years of neglect. His lips tightened. Exactly what I warned them about. With careful precision, he bypassed it, connecting wires to reroute the flow. It was dangerous, temporary, but enough to wake the beast. "Come on," he whispered, twisting the last screw. His hands shook with age but held steady with purpose. "Come back to me." For a heartbeat. Nothing, then dash click. The lights overhead flickered. Once, twice, then blazed to life. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared awake like a lion dragged from sleep. The floor vibrated beneath his knees. The train shuddered, then rolled forward, wheels clanking, alive once more. Redemption and Sparstamas sagged against the wall, chest heaving. Relief washed over him, mingled with something else, pride. Not the arrogance of youth, but the quiet pride of a man who had given everything and thought it lost. In the corridor beyond, he heard it. Gasps, laughter, applause. The passengers had no idea how close they had come to disaster. They would never know how simple, how fragile the fix had been, or how necessary his presence was. But Thomas knew. For the first time in decades, he felt needed. Returned to the carriage, he pushed. The panel closed, wiped his hands on his coat, and straightened. His knees ached, his back screamed, his heart felt strangely light. He opened the door and stepped back into the carriage. The scene stunned him. Passengers were on their feet, clapping, some even crying. Faces that had sneered now glowed with gratitude. The two college boys who had mocked him earlier sat pale and silent, their laughter gone. The young attendant rushed forward, eyes wide. "Sir, how did you?" Thomas set the old screwdriver down on a seat alongside the empty whiskey bottle. The bottle represented who they thought he was. The screwdriver revealed who he truly had been. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the noise. "I built it." For a long moment after Thomas spoke, the words hung in the air like smoke. "I built it." The passengers froze, staring at him. Conversations that had erupted into relief and cheer moments ago dissolved into whispers, questions, and stunned silence. The two college boys who had mocked him earlier exchanged guilty glances, unable to meet his eyes. The young attendant, still trembling from the chaos of the blackout, stepped closer. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir."
What do you...
"Mean you built it?" Thomas leaned back against the seat, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. His hands, still blackened with grease, trembled faintly. His gaze swept across the carriage. He saw suspicion in some eyes, wonder in others, and shame in those who had judged him too quickly. For the first time in decades, people were listening, breaking. The silence, he drew a deep breath, his voice gravelly but steady. "My name is Thomas Grayson. 30 years ago, I was chief engineer for the Eastern Rail Company. The circuits that failed tonight, the ones I just fixed, I designed them. Back then, they called me the guardian of the rails." Gasps rippled through the carriage. A man near the aisle muttered, "That can't be true. He's just a drunk." But the attendant silenced him with a sharp glance. "Let him speak," she said, surprising even herself with the authority in her voice. Thomas continued, his eyes distant as though he were seeing ghosts. "I built trains the way some men build cathedrals. Every wire, every switch, every fuse mattered. People's lives depended on them. My life depended on them. I gave everything I had to these rails." He paused, his throat tightening, but the world moves on. The company brought in younger men with computers. Faster, cheaper. They said my instincts weren't enough anymore. They called it retirement, but it was exile. And then, his voice faltered. Then my wife got sick. The carriage was silent now, save for the steady rumble of the train. Beneath them, fragments of the past. He closed his eyes, and memories spilled forth. She was my anchor. Margaret, when I came home late, smelling of grease and smoke, she didn't complain. She just smiled and said, "Dinner's cold, but I waited for you." When she died, the house became unbearable. Empty walls, empty bed, empty man. A woman across the aisle wiped her eyes quietly. My daughter tried to help. Emily, sweet girl. She wanted me to keep going, but grief is a heavy thing. When the company pushed me out, I had nothing left. No work, no wife, no purpose. He glanced at the empty bottle still lying on the seat. The bottle was easy, too easy. It filled the silence when no one else would. Soon, people stopped seeing me as an engineer. They just saw the drunk. His voice cracked, but he pressed on. And maybe they were right. Maybe I let myself become that. But I never stopped listening. Even when I had nothing, I could still hear the trains. Every hum, every groan still spoke to me, even when people didn't. Responds for a long time, no one spoke. The train thundered onward, carrying not just bodies, but the weight of his confession. Then, child's voice broke the silence. The little girl who had been clutching her mother's hand earlier tugged free and stepped forward. She held out a folded white handkerchief with trembling fingers. "Here, mister," she said softly. "You can have this for your hands." Thomas stared at her, his eyes glistening. His calloused fingers accepted the gift, simple cloth far more valuable than gold. "Thank you," he whispered. The college boys stood abruptly. One of them, red-faced, cleared his throat. We're sorry," he muttered. "We shouldn't have said those things." His friend nodded quickly, unable to speak. Other passengers followed suit. Some applauded quietly. Others reached out to shake his hand. A middle-aged man pressed a few crumpled bills into his palm. A woman offered half a sandwich. They were small gestures, but each one chipped away at the wall of invisibility that had surrounded him for so long. The young attendant knelt beside him, her eyes shining. "Mr. Grayson, you saved us. Tonight you proved you're still the guardian of the rails." Thomas gave a faint smile, but it was tinged with sorrow. "Guardian or not, I'm just an old man who couldn't let the rails die on my watch." Reflection. And regret. The applause faded into murmurs as passengers returned to their seats. But their glances toward Thomas carried a new weight, respect, not disdain. He sat quietly, staring at the handkerchief in his hands. His reflection wavered in the train window, showing not just the man he was now, but the man he had once been. He thought of Margaret's smile, Emily's laughter, the pride he once carried in his chest. For the first time in decades, he felt those pieces stirring within him again. But regret clung to him, heavy and cold. If only Emily could see me now. If only she knew her father wasn't completely lost. A single thought gnawed at him. Is it too late to be remembered? The carriage watched as the passengers continued to steal. Glances at him. They whispered to each other, not in mockery, but in awe. They had boarded the train with a stranger they dismissed as worthless. Now they realized they had been riding beside a man who had once kept thousands alive, who had carried responsibility on his back for decades. The irony was sharp. They had needed him all along, and only in crisis had they seen it. Thomas leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, the rocking of the train felt comforting, not haunting. The train rolled steadily through the night, its wheels clattering a rhythm both ancient and comforting. The lights inside the carriage now burned bright, warm against the darkness outside. Passengers shifted in their seats, settling into the calm that always follows fear. Yet their eyes kept wandering back to the old man who sat quietly near the window, his head bowed slightly, his fingers turning a folded white handkerchief over and over as though it were a relic. Thomas Grayson was silent, but his silence was no longer the silence of invisibility. It was the silence of a man finally seen. The journey toward the station, outside. The hills of Pennsylvania unfurled under a waning moon. Trees flashed by in silver streaks, rivers glimmered faintly. The stars stretched across the sky like scattered sparks. Inside, the atmosphere was changed. Where once there had been suspicion and mockery, there was now reverence. Some passengers whispered to each other about the blackout, marveling at how close disaster had come. Others sat in quiet reflection, ashamed of the way they had judged. The old man just hours before, a middle-aged businessman, who had been among the loudest complainers earlier, now sat with his hands clasped, his eyes flicking toward Thomas with guilt. A young mother rocked her baby gently, whispering words of thanks under her breath. Even the two college boys, who had laughed the hardest, now leaned forward in their seats, whispering, "He really saved us. It's the real deal," and all. The while, the attendant, the only one who had dared to trust him at the crucial moment, stood near, her gaze fixed on him with quiet awe, gratitude in small gestures as the train neared the next station. Passengers began to stir. Luggage was adjusted, coats pulled on, children roused from uneasy sleep. But no one left without first glancing at Thomas, one by one. They approached. A woman in a faded blue coat pressed a sandwich into his hands. "For later," she said softly. An older man, eyes brimming with tears, gripped Thomas's shoulder. "You reminded me of my brother. He worked the rails too. You for all of us." Even the businessman bent slightly, offering his hand. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "I think we all did." Thomas accepted these gestures quietly, almost shyly, his weathered face revealing more surprise than pride. He was not used to being acknowledged. Not anymore. Finally, the little girl came forward again, her small hand clutching the hem of her mother's coat. She looked up at Thomas with solemn eyes, far older than her years. "Are you really a hero?" I asked Thomas. Chuckled softly, though it was a sound weighted with sadness. "No, sweetheart, I'm just a man who remembers how things work." She frowned, unconvinced, then held out the handkerchief once more. "Then promise me you'll keep it, so you don't forget who you are." For a long moment, Thomas couldn't speak. His throat closed, his chest ached. He reached out with trembling hands and accepted the cloth again, pressing it to his heart. "I promise," he whispered. Arrival, the train slowed as it approached the station, brakes screeching softly, sparks flickering against steel. Outside, lamps glowed in neat rows, casting golden halos across the platform. The whistle blew. The train shuddered to a halt. Doors opened with a hiss, releasing passengers into the cool night air. People disembarked, but many lingered, turning back for one last glance at the old man. A few lifted their hands in farewell. Some simply nodded, unable to put their gratitude into words. The attendant remained, watching him closely. "Mr. Grayson," she said quietly, "you could stay." I could tell the company who you are. They should know." Thomas shook his head gently. "The company's memory is short. It wouldn't matter. What matters is tonight the train lived. And so did everyone on it." Her eyes welled. "But you, what about you?" He smiled faintly. "I've already had my life. Tonight I just borrowed a little of it back." The walk into the night when most of the passengers had left, Thomas stood slowly, leaning on the armrest for balance, slipped the screwdriver into his pocket, tucked the handkerchief into his coat, picked up the empty bottle not as a crutch now, but as a reminder of the man he refused to remain. He walked down the aisle, each step deliberate. For once no one laughed. No one mocked. The silence that followed him was filled with respect. At the doorway, he paused, glancing back at the carriage. His reflection caught in the glass grease, stained weary, but no longer invisible. Then he stepped onto the platform. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of coal and oil. Station lights haloed his figure as he walked slowly across the platform, his shadow stretching long behind him. One by one, passengers drifted away into the city, but many turned once more to watch him. Some would tell the story to their families, some would forget. But none would ever look at a ragged old man on a train the same way again. The final whisper at the edge of the platform, Thomas stopped. The rails stretched out before him, gleaming faintly in the lamplight, disappearing into the horizon. He stared at them for a long moment, his breath clouding in the cold air. He reached down, touched the steel with calloused fingers, and whispered, "Once an engineer, always an engineer." Then, without fanfare, without applause, he walked into the night. Epilogue in silence back on the train. The attendant lingered, staring at the platform long after Thomas had vanished into the shadows. She held the image of him in her mind, the way he had stood against the darkness, the way his hands had brought the train back to life, the way he carried himself with quiet dignity, even in rags. When the doors closed and the train pulled away, she whispered into the empty carriage, "Guardian of the rails." The name lived again, if only in memory, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the station. Thomas Grayson kept walking alone, but not forgotten.